Well, I think I know most of you, but I'm Holden Thorpe. I'm the provost. It's my pleasure to be here to welcome you to Danielle Allen's talk. And people ask me all the time, I was a chancellor before I came here, and people ask me what are the good things about being a provost and not a chancellor. There are a lot of them, but one of them is when you're the provost, when you're the chancellor, you come give welcoming remarks, and then you leave and go give welcoming remarks somewhere else. When you're the provost, you give welcoming remarks, and then you actually get to stay for the talk. So I'm very happy about that. Just want to really note the success of the American Culture Studies Modern Segregation Lecture and Workshop, and congratulate Rebecca and Ivor Bernstein and Clarissa Hayward on all the success that the program has had. Obviously, it is coming along at an important time in American history and in the history of our city. But it is, these are topics that we have been working on at WashU for a long, long time. And what's that? Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah, we're probably, do you have a, okay, she's got a pin on mic, so she'll be okay. These are topics that we've been working on here for quite a long time, and couldn't be more timely than they are right now. So it's an honor for me to be with you, and Danielle, thanks for making the trip. And it's now my job to turn it over to Ian McMullen. Oh, no, to Ivor. Sorry.
Thank you, Holden. And I'm going to turn it over to Ian, who will introduce Danielle in a second. Just to say very briefly, thank you to the faculty, students, and community who have come to one or multiple of these staged conversations about modern segregation, allowed us to create what we've been calling a through line of conceptual and empirical discussion, which one doesn't often have for these kinds of events. So 4 events, this is the last. We'll have a conversation that will continue at 3 o'clock in an informal chat with Professor Allen at Macmillan 219, to which all are invited. I think if everybody in this room came, we would have a lot of folks in Macmillan 219. But if you are stimulated to come continue this conversation, we'll be continuing it at 3 o'clock in an informal chat in Macmillan 219. Thank you to Dave Walsh, the AMCS instructional technology developer, Courtney Gray, the American Cultural Studies Digital Projects Coordinator, and Terry Baer, the Events Coordinator, for making these 4 lecture workshops happen, work so smoothly, with all kinds of exciting connectivity to the innovative AMCS digital platform. Podcasts, interviews, stage engagements on sites of modern segregation, all of that coming soon. Let me introduce Ian McMullen, who will introduce Professor Allen. Ian is Assistant Professor of Political Science, arrived at Washington University in 2007 after receiving his PhD in government from Harvard in 2004. He's a leading political theorist, author of 2 books, the soon-to-appear Civics Beyond Critics, Character, Education in a Liberal Democracy, Oxford 2015, and the book Faith in Schools, Autonomy, Citizenship, and Religious Education in the Liberal State, Princeton 2007, as well as quite a few articles, reviews. He's received major fellowships from the Spencer Foundation. He has an impressive administrative profile as well. He was Assistant Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences for 3 years, and more pertinently, he is the director of the Political Theory Workshop and a crucial collaborator with an affiliated faculty member with AMCS. Ian, handing it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivor, both for that introduction and for shepherding these 4 events in the Modern Segregation series. I've been to all of them, and I've been really impressed, so thanks so much. Quite a few years ago, Washington University's flagship speaker program on campus, the Assembly Series, included a lecture on autism by Temple Grandin. It may not be obvious why I'm starting here, and maybe it won't be obvious in a couple of minutes' time, but I hope so. So Temple Grandin came to give a lecture on autism, and for reasons that will remain obscure, I was put in charge of leading a student group discussion after the lecture to digest the themes of the talk. I didn't know anything about autism, and I had never heard of Temple Grandin. So I figured that I'd better start by doing some research. So I turned to what at the time was still sometimes called the information superhighway. And I entered Temple Grandin into some primitive form of search engine that was at that time available. And given that Temple Grandin struck me at the time and still as rather an unusual kind of name, I was surprised to discover that there were not one, but two eminent scholars by the name of Temple Grandin, one of whom was indeed an expert on autism, and the other of whom seemingly was a visionary designer of slaughterhouses. This seemed to me really quite remarkable. And some of you know the punchline, right? Indeed, maybe the punchline is obvious, even if you don't know much about Temple Grandin. About halfway through the actual lecture, I discovered that there was one and only one Temple Grandin, and that in fact her extraordinary achievement, groundbreaking achievement, was to apply her understanding of autism and the kinds of thought and behavioral sort of patterns it involves to understanding the behavior of animals and thinking in particular about how one could more humanely handle livestock. So just one Temple Grandin in the end. So my thought here, a little contrived, I grant you, is that if an expert on, say, autism and or slaughterhouse technique had been invited to give the introduction to our guest, Danielle Allen, today, a similar error might have resulted. A quick Google search for Danielle Allen would have revealed that there are, in fact, two eminent scholars called Danielle Allen, one of whom is a Harvard-trained political scientist, an expert on issues of citizenship and equality in America, and the other of whom is trained at the University of Cambridge in classics and is an expert on ancient Athens. And one might have presumed, I suppose, that the former Danielle Allen rather than the latter would be showing up to give this session. But of course, in fact, this would have been an error. There is only one Danielle Allen, or at least the two people, right, yes. The two people that I just described turn out to be one and the same. There are presumably many other Danielle Allens. Unlike Temple Grandin may, for all I know, be genuinely a unique name. So it's one and the same person. Those two PhDs are both hers, quite strikingly. And you might think, sort of cheekily, that getting PhDs is a bit like losing parents in, Oscar Wilde's famous quip, right? That the first time it's misfortune, and the second time it looks like carelessness or something. One ought to learn from one's mistakes, and surely getting a second PhD is warrants some kind of condemnation. But I think we can agree, or you would agree if you had a chance to examine Professor Allen's extraordinary work, that she has made very, very fine use of the diverse and broad training that she has received. She has a combination of particular skills and knowledge that is almost certainly unique. She is a masterful reader of texts. She is a rigorous historian. She is an insightful political theorist, a visionary philosopher, and a pioneering social scientist. Few people can claim to be one of those five things, and Professor Allen, I think, can plausibly be described as all of them. And the fact that she does all of these things simultaneously has rendered her, I think, one of our most acute observers and analysts of politics in democratic societies, or at least societies that aspire to be democracies in some meaningful sense. At an age when most scholars with half as many PhDs as Professor Allen, myself included, at an age when most such scholars were working anxiously towards a decision about tenure, I know very much how that feels, Professor Allen had long since won a MacArthur Genius Grant and was exiting the job of Dean of the Humanities at the University of Chicago. She had been there and done that. Now, you might think the fact that she was exiting that job is kind of understandable as an example of burnout, right? I mean, early success in a career of the kind that Professor Allen achieved can lead to, an unfortunate kind of, slump in mid-career. This was not what was happening when Professor Allen left the University of Chicago. She was, in fact, on her way to fill the post newly vacated by Michael Walzer, one of the great political theorists of his generation at the Institute for Advanced Study, an academic center in New Jersey, whose elite status, I think, is signaled in various ways. One of which is that it doesn't like to be confused with its less prestigious neighbor, Princeton University, right? Not many places can say that. It was, of course, the longtime academic home of Albert Einstein, like All Souls College at Oxford. It has the great inconvenience of having no it has a great convenience of having no inconvenient students around to get in the way of the scholarship. And perhaps most striking of all, as a sort of signal of its prestige, insiders refer to it simply as the Institute. And I think if you're at the Institute, you know that you're at the top place. So as we invite Professor Allen to help us conclude this series of events on modern segregation, it is natural, I think, to highlight her two major book-length contributions to American political thought. Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown v. the Board of Education, was the University of Chicago Press in 2004, and the very recently published Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. And the first of these two books, Talking to Strangers from 10 years ago, is especially germane to our present purposes. In it, Professor Allen proposed that the Supreme Court's 1954 school desegregation decision could have been and could still be the catalyst for developing and implementing a new conception of American citizenship as political friendship, to use her phrase, across deep lines of historical difference and distrust. As she explained at dinner last night, and as her pre-circulated paper makes clear, the work that Professor Allen will be sharing with us today builds upon that inspiring vision of a democratic society and its citizens. Professor Allen.
Thank you, Ian. Let me see if I can get these mics going the way I'm supposed to. All right, I'm all set. And you all can hear me all right? Great. Thank you, Ian, again, for a generous introduction. And thank you, Ivor, so much for the invitation. And Clarissa, I think I saw you come in at some point. Terrific to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with all of you, especially given the events of the last 6 months. So I feel I have to tell a couple of stories about the other Danielle Allens in the world. So there is, in fact, another eminent scholarly Danielle Allen, whose most famous book is called Colon Care. And I have actually been introduced once with that as among the things that I've published. I would like here publicly to disclaim any knowledge about the gastrointestinal system. I know nothing about GI tracts. So the second story is one that actually pertains in some sense to our themes today, which is, so I was at Chicago for 10 years, living in Hyde Park. I remember sitting one day in my front room reading sort of bay windows, and an unmarked police car pulled up in front. And unmarked police cars are, never really unmarked, right? I mean, you always know when you see them. It's an unmarked police car. At any rate, two men got out, not wearing uniforms, but with guns, and walked up to my front door, bang, bang, bang. I was like, wow, this is surprising and unusual. And needless to say, I was nervous. So I opened the door, and they said, "We're looking for Danielle Allen." And I said, "It is I." Literally, that's what I said. And so one of them went and walked away back to his car. And then the other one said, "Well, and is your birth date October 3rd, 1971? I said, "No, it's November 3rd, 1971. And it turned out they were looking for a Danielle Allen who had just run over and killed her boyfriend. So at any rate, I confirmed that my birth date was different to the first one, and my grammatical precision had already convinced the first police officer that I couldn't possibly be the target. And the second one was also convinced in short order, happily, and so they left. So there's a story in there about class, right, operating alongside race in encounters with the police. At any rate, I could go. I've had other encounters with the police too, which are very different kinds, in fact, that weren't resolved quite so easily with class, the tools of class. And I didn't even know that that was the resource I would draw on. It was just sort of the instinctive reaction and the confrontation with authority to draw on that particular resource. Won't go into the other stories at the moment, but at any rate, so we're here to talk today about modern segregation and the city in the spirit of the investigations that you've had. My own work is as a political philosopher, and so in that regard, I am constantly working on the question of where we should be going, more really than on the question of where we are, although I am the kind of political philosopher who thinks that you can only figure out how to get where you want to go by having a quite developed sense of where you actually are starting from. So in that regard, I have taken the invitation of the modern segregation conversation to be one about trying to understand the world, social world in which we find ourselves now in 2014, and then to situate my work about where we should be going in relationship to that diagnosis of the present. And so it's important to start in some sense with the question of, well, what exactly are the preconceptions that we bring to thinking about our social world and to the concept of segregation? And here I think I will not say anything that's not familiar to you. I mean, segregation is an evocative term, and it evokes for us generally, I think, the Jim Crow South. And we understand the Jim Crow South as a place that used de jure segregation to keep black and white separate in school, in commercial zones, a variety of other institutional forms, coupled with cultural separation that is sort of evidenced in the famous statement by Martin Luther King Jr. that Americans are never more apart than on Sunday, right? Blacks worship in black churches and whites worship in white churches. That Jim Crow South that we imagine is one that I think is pretty much commonly recognized as a construction, not the result of sort of natural social choices, but of municipal policies, federal policies, state-level policies. And in fact, I mean, if you look at the overall history of segregation, take Charlotte, North Carolina, a community on which I did some research, what people like to say about a place like Charlotte is that in the 1910s, 1920s, it still had what we'd call salt and pepper residential situation. That is to say, actually quite mixed residential situation. And this is not surprising in a certain way because at the point of the Civil War, if you take the South, I mean, actually residential patterns were quite mixed because the fact of slavery required mixing. It's the paradox of it. At any rate, and then post the 20s, a heck of a lot of municipal ordinances, state ordinances in places like Chicago, things like freeway construction, decisions about how to think about things like urban renewal, housing policy, and so forth, actively segregated places that had not been segregated to the same degree. And there are things like restricted covenants and all that sort of thing, built the black-white separate world that we knew in the middle of the 20th century and that we then understood legal decisions, beginning with Brown versus Board of Education, but also, I should go back to the Supreme Court decisions on housing, the end of restrictive covenants, Brown versus Board of Education, and so forth, was meant to be taking all of that apart. And so then in some sense we had a moment in the late 60s and 70s where I think this country generally thought that it was on a new trajectory to some sort of different kind of world. And the terms for talking about that were a world of integration. I'll come back to that term in a little bit. And in some sense, we haven't really updated our understanding of how segregation operates for the present context. And so as we try to understand current circumstances, we tend still to be working with that picture we have from the middle of the 20th century in the back of our minds. So what I'm going to do is start off today with just a few details to update our picture. I imagine some of these will repeat things that you've already heard earlier this fall, and I'll be interested in our discussions for where my picture lines up or distances itself from the pictures that you've already been developing over the course of the fall. And then I'll try to use that updated picture of segregation to say something about what kind of ideals should help us think about where to go from here, sort of given where we are. So from my point of view, one of the most important features of the current situation is actually a story about the global economy and the US economy in particular. So this is a graph from Thomas Piketty's recent book, Capital in the 21st Century, which tells an important story about the growth of income and wealth inequality in this country particularly, but also more broadly in developed countries around the world over the course of the 20th century. We've known this fact about the growth of income inequality for a long time. What's important about Piketty's book is just the massive quantities of data that he's got to back it up, and the fact that he's actually now been able to tell a story that's 2 centuries long. But see how well you can see. So 1982 is the point at which income inequality begins to increase significantly. So what this graph represents is the pre-tax income share of the top % of earners in the US, right? Okay. And so that would actually, most of the people in this room would be in that category. Okay, so we are the beneficiaries of a massive restructuring of the US and global economies. And so what that really means is that we have a population now that has, the middle class, as you know, has sort of thinned out and sort of bigger on the low income end, and then there's the income is all sort of concentrated quite at the top. One of the intuitive ways of getting a sense of the consequences of this is just to think about what's happened with retail over the last 20 years, which is that low-end retailers and high-end retailers are doing well, and the middle part of the market is what's emptied out. So if you think about suburban shopping malls, that were anchored by a Macy's or a Bloomingdale or a Sears, those have seen incredible decline because it's that middle income group that they don't any longer have the constituency for. Whereas think about urban centers that have increased the density of the high-end luxury stores. Luxury goods continue to be, it's a growing market. It's a growing market, luxury goods, right? And then low-end, the Walmarts and Targets of the world are a growing market. Okay, so our cities, as people have moved back into the cities, the movement in has been a combination of the high end, right, and then the continuing residence of people at the very low end. And socioeconomic segregation in the country generally has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. A good book on the overall picture is something called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. Has that book come up a bit? So he's good at sort of all these different patterns. So that's an important thing to recognize, that socioeconomic segregation is one of the most important features of the current landscape. Now, that growth in the accrual of income to the top 10% coincides with the growth in mass incarceration. Okay, so I've put the red arrow at the 1982 point, so you can see, so this is the curve, the line up in the rates of incarceration, and it tracks in its general picture of growth the change in the structure of income in this country. So in that regard, one has to recognize that mass incarceration is partly a way of managing the decrease of economic opportunity at the lower end of the social scale. All right? So these things are related to each other. It's not that mass incarceration is its own phenomenon simply driven by policing or the politics of different parties trying to one-up each other with regard to how punitive they can be. It intersects with the complexity of the economic situation and a considerable realignment in our economic fortunes. So, third important point. This is, from my point of view, one of the most disturbing statistics that I know about. And this is 2014 data from the Department of Education on discipline disparities in schools. This is preschool data, okay? Preschool kids. The yellow is African Americans. The first column is enrollment. So the preschool population measured in 2014 was 18% African American. 42% of the kids getting out-of-school suspensions were African American. 48% getting multiple out-of-school suspensions were African American. Okay? So in other words, in our schools, from the very earliest of ages, we are treating different populations differently with regard to expectations and penalty and so forth. There's a fantastic book by a guy named Angel Harris called Kids Don't Want to Fail, which debunks the idea that the achievement gap in schools has to do with oppositional culture. There's something called Ogbu's oppositional culture thesis, which is the thesis that black kids don't want to act white, and that they peer pressure against acting white is what reduces black achievement. And Harris shows conclusively that that's not the case, and actually educational aspirations are more intense and higher in the African American community than in any other community. The achievement gap is not caused by a motivational problem. It's caused instead by something that's happening, in his argument, in school. When kids get to school, there is no achievement gap, but there is an achievement gap by the end, once you control for class, Once you control for class, there's no achievement gap when kids get to school. But by the end of kindergarten, there's an achievement gap, even controlling for class, i.e. middle-income black kids, middle-income white kids. By the end of kindergarten, there's an achievement gap, okay? This, in my view, is probably why, okay? The disparate approach to penalizing different populations. These three pictures I've showed you, so then changing economic situation, changing economic opportunity, mass incarceration, culture of penalty, a culture of penality that even enters into school at the earliest age of preschool, these are the forces behind the restructuring of our cities, if you ask me, okay? So this is not a watertight, nailed down social science presentation. What I'm trying to do is simply indicate to you, from my reading of the research, what I take to be the most important explanatory elements. So, the overall picture one gets from these things, to repeat, is increased socioeconomic segregation in the country as a whole. Cities taken as a whole have somewhat less black-white racial segregation than 20 years ago because of more middle-income mixing. So, and that's by the measure of difference that sociologists use to indicate how separated people are. Middle-income suburbs are also considered to be less segregated because of movement of Latinos and Asians into suburbs, although it tends to be the case that people move in their ethnic community, so it's a bit of a mixed story in terms of whether it counts as a sort of integration of the suburbs or not. I mean, one could sort of tell the story in either way. And then finally, low-income areas have increased hypersegregation. So they are even sort of more, low-income areas are even more separated from the rest of society than other areas. This is the strongest, most impact for African Americans. It's also true for Latinos, but not quite as true. There's a little bit more blurring of lines, neighborhood lines, for example, among low-income Latino neighborhoods, low-income Asian neighborhoods, and so forth, whereas the neighborhoods for African Americans are more rigidly separated from other neighborhoods. So what you see in this picture is a kind of intersection of changing class dynamics and race dynamics, okay? And one has to break out the two components. They don't totally track straightforwardly on each other when one's telling the story about modern segregation. Okay, so here's where we are. We know some important facts about what our world is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. Namely, I guess the date people are using these days is 2042 for the point at which this would be a majority-minority country, right, where no group will be a majority in the country. And in some sense, we're already there in that the 2010, the kids who were born in 2011 are the first majority-minority birth cohort in the country. This year's school entering cohort is the first majority-minority school entering cohort in the country. The difference between those numbers, because the 2011 ones aren't in school yet, is immigration, right? So in that regard, immigration is accelerating the natural birth effect of moving to a majority-minority society. So somebody asked me this morning in an interview, Douglas, who did a great job in an interview, where are we going to be in 2042? What is segregation going to look like then, or what is this country going to look like? Is it going to look like South Africa, apartheid South Africa, or is it going to look like something else? And my answer to Douglas was, there's no point projecting what we're going to be, because what's actually happening is that the decisions we're making now will answer that question. So the project is less to project what will happen than to figure out right now how to be on the path we want to be on with regard to the kind of society we want to have by 2042. Okay? So the rest of my talk is really going to be about that. What kind of path would I argue that we should try to be on? And then after sketching some ideals, that's what I do, so philosopher, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to say how we do it. Okay? So the actual practical part of the story entails a collective effort of all citizens and anybody with any institutional power. And it requires the brain power of everybody in this room and everybody you know, and it is an incredibly hard set of problems. So let's try to figure it out. Should we be pursuing an integrated society? My argument is that we don't actually, that's not the right vocabulary to use, the vocabulary of integration. And the reason for that is because the vocabulary of integration in the 20th century typically got connected up with the vocabulary of assimilation. Okay, the integration meant assimilation and vice versa. And the trouble with that vocabulary is that it is always cast in the language of expecting one group or another group to adopt all the norms of the majority or the dominant group. And there is, in political philosophy, what we would call a sort of a recognition harm that's done that way. So you've got cultural traditions, traditions of identity that are not fully recognized and made part of the whole social fabric, with consequence to the individuals who come from those traditions and a reduction in their ability to live a flourishing life. So if the goal of social policy and the goal of citizenship is to help us all build a world where everybody has the opportunity to live a flourishing life, then one of the things that's necessary is that people be able to express and live out their identities in ways that don't require them to cut off meaningful pieces of those identities. So that's a problem with how the language of integration has worked. Another ideal that has been drawn on a lot is the ideal of a multicultural society. And this ideal comes precisely out of that theory of recognition that I just invoked. So a philosopher named Charles Taylor was an important exponent of this view. And Canada worked very hard on developing multiculturalism as a matter of state policy. Now, in the multicultural argument, as it has unfolded in policy context, it's typically involved reifying cultural blocks. So you've got this group and you've got that group, and you distribute particular resources according to the size of the groups in the fullest sense of it, you'll have representation in a political body based on population sizes of different ethnic groups, for example, or different linguistic groups. So the trouble with multiculturalism is that it doesn't fully acknowledge the hybridity of identity, both the fact that identities change over time, the fact that boundaries between groups can and should shift. There should be a kind of constant evolution in our social and cultural fabric. So whereas on the one hand, the integration and assimilation ideal don't do enough to recognize identity, I would say that the multiculturalism paradigm makes identity too static. And if you try to build political institutions on it, what you end up doing is also reinforcing patterns of disadvantage at the same time that you're trying to remedy them. So what might be an alternative? Let me actually add one more element to the criticism of these earlier ideals. So behind both of these sets of ideals, both the integration and assimilation ideal on the one hand and the multiculturalism ideal, is a vocabulary of inclusion and exclusion. Okay, so what do I mean by that exactly? So we consider the United States to be an example of a set of liberal political institutions. They are founded in the late 18th century, in the dawn of liberalism, by which I'm not referring to sort of contemporary politics of welfare or whatever else. I'm talking about rather the notion that human beings have rights, that government should rest on the consent of the people, that sovereignty should be built out of the people, and therefore institutions should protect basic human freedoms, protect equality, and again, somehow or other make the sovereignty of the people a real thing. So that's the sort of basic idea of liberalism at the end of the 18th century. As you all know, the origins of liberalism are shot through with contradictions. In this country, we've sort of got a new republic or a democracy going, but at the same time, the country reaffirmed slavery and built slavery into the Constitution. So how does one make sense of the relationship between the noble ideals all men are created equal, and the fact of the ongoing and affirmation of the use of slavery as a part of a political system, affirming equality and freedom for all? The way people made sense of that to themselves was to begin to use a vocabulary of inclusion and exclusion. The mistake that was made, as the story goes, is that some people were excluded from that noble framework of egalitarian inclusion. And therefore, the fix to the problem is to include people who'd been previously excluded. And so if you look at the materials written in the mid-20th century around the end of Jim Crow segregation, you'll see invocation of the need to include over and over again, that there's been a problem of exclusion. The segregated African Americans have been excluded from mainstream political institutions, mainstream educational institutions, and need to be included. And my argument would be, in fact, that the language of inclusion and exclusion misdescribes the nature of the problem. So it was not the case in 1776 and then 1787 and 1789 that some people were inside and other people were outside of the political system. It's true that some people had political rights and other people didn't, but there was a single social political system that included the liberation of some and the domination of others. These pieces were worked together with one another. So the problem of the oppression of African Americans in the 19th century, of what I would call the genocide of Native Americans, is a problem of domination, not a problem of exclusion. Which means the project of rectification is a project of figuring out how to build a social system that is non-dominating, that does not involve domination. So it's not the project simply of finding ways to include, it's a project of finding ways to move from habits of domination to habits of non-domination. And let me say one more thing about what I mean by that move. So this is a point that I get from a political philosopher named George Kateb, who is a Princeton faculty member, emeritus now, who has a great book coming out this spring on Lincoln's political thought. And I learned something from that book, which I'd never kind of taken on board before, which the thought goes like this. So you have this world, again, as I said, where a new set of political institutions were built based on these principles of equality and freedom, and yet the institutions, as I said, were simultaneously liberating some and dominating others. Now, there's another wrinkle, which is that for those who were liberated by the new republic, who had new political rights, the chance to shape their own destiny, they told themselves, they were told by political leaders, they were told by public writings that the experience they were having was one of equality. Okay? So in other words, day to day, as they went through their lives, they were learning we're egalitarians. Think about Tocqueville and the contrast that Tocqueville draws between the Americans and the French. Right? The idea is the Americans have an egalitarian social culture. They're distinct from any other country in the world because they've developed this egalitarian social culture. So then here's the wrinkle, which comes from George Kateb. Generations of Americans were miseducated because what they thought felt like equality, the ordinary stuff of daily interaction, the way of being in the world with others that they were learning, which they gave the name of equality, was actually a set of habits about domination. Okay? So we mislearned what was really domination. We mislearned, we were trying to learn how to be equals with one another, but we were actually learning how to be dominating of some people, and we called it equality. Wow, okay? That's a very significant cultural problem to try to overcome. Miseducation in terms of the basic understanding of what it means to be with others on an equal footing. That's the work we have to do. To move from domination to non-domination, one actually has to learn what it means to live on an equal footing with a diverse group of others, and what that feels like in material ways, how one interacts in public spaces, how one has exchanges, whether it's in the supermarket, on the street, in shopping markets, even at cocktail parties when people from different groups end up coming together into the same space. One could go on the list, and I think, speaking for myself, I imagine the experience I've had would be one that's familiar to others. I have been in innumerable contexts where, although I ostensibly share a background with the other people in the room, I'm an academic too, or it's a board meeting and we're all members of the same board, there are nonetheless incredible social difficulties around lines of race and gender. So it's sort of up and down the class structure. We have trouble, actually, at the level of our basic habits in conveying egalitarian bonds with one another. So anyway, I said that I could give you examples from my own experience. I won't do that now. I imagine that that's something that would resonate with everybody in one way or another. And figuring out how to re-educate ourselves in that regard, give ourselves a genuine education in egalitarianism is one of the very hard projects of moving away from domination to non-domination. And that's a point that when one focuses on exclusion and inclusion, I think we miss. Because again, it seems as if just plain getting people inside the institutions is the basic fix. Whereas actually, this is where you get to the language of climate, right, that we've all learned to talk about inside universities. What matters is not just getting people in, what matters is the kind of climate of interaction that we build inside the institutions into which we've now brought diverse populations. Okay? So what kind of ideal do I use to articulate this egalitarian project? I talk about a connected society. Okay? So I don't talk about an integrated society these days. I don't talk about a multicultural society. I talk about a connected society. And what I mean by that, okay, it's egalitarian, but more specifically, it maximizes, this is a society that maximizes bridging connections while also supporting bonding connections. So let me explain what that means. So bonding connections, bonding ties, are the relationships we have with the people who are most to us. They're closest to us because it's the families we're born into, the relatives we have, the neighborhoods we live in, the churches that we go to. Bridging ties are ties that we have with people who are more distant from us. We have less in common with them. And to some extent, we have to translate from our position to their position in terms of our interactions with each other. At the most extreme level, think of, if you want an example of somebody who bridges, think of a translator who works at the United Nations and has to help somebody from China and somebody from the US come to a common understanding about the shape of the world. Okay, that's a very extreme example. But all of us every day ought to be able to be good at bridging relationships. And there's a lot of work in the social sciences which has made the point that societies with more bridging relationships are more egalitarian, more economically egalitarian, as well as more socially and politically egalitarian. And there are lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that information circulates far more quickly in contexts where there are more bridging ties across communities. And when information circulates more quickly, economic opportunities circulate more quickly. And I could go into that and say more about it, but it's just really important that those bridging ties are actually one of the really profound ways of helping a society become more egalitarian. alongside bridging ties, every human being needs bonding ties. So this is not an argument that we should all sort of give up the specific identities and cultural horizons that give our lives meaning, not at all. But one, in addition to valuing and in taking pleasure in one's bonding ties, one needs to cultivate bonding ties in such a way that one is open to bridging ties. So a connected society is one in which the project of human development involves both what I refer to as cosmopolitan bonding, okay, which is a sort of paradoxical idea, and strength at bridging. There are skills involved along both dimensions, skills that can be cultivated and taught. We actually spent a lot of time thinking about bonding skills, positive relations with mothers and fathers and inside families, and think about psychotherapy. I mean, that's a space where the focus is really on the health of bonding ties. We don't have an equivalently developed vocabulary and professional understanding of how to support bridging ties, how to help people be good at them, practice them, identify the skills involved, and so forth. There is literature on that. I could speak to that to some degree, but it's nowhere nearly as developed as the literature we have on bonding skills. So let's see. Okay, so this is a vision, right? Okay, the connected society, and you'll probably want me to specify it a little bit more when we get to the discussion time, but I'll leave it there for the moment. So I want to just close with a few words about the question of how we might get from that world of segregation that we live in now, that I pointed out in the beginning, to a connected society that has maximized bridging ties, where there's a lot of fluidity and mobility. There might be some sort of bumpiness in residential patterns. It's not a matter of kind of completely having people live in a random distribution, either ethnically or socioeconomically. It might be lumpy, but nonetheless there would be enough bridging ties that there would be interaction across those lines of difference. That's one of the key elements of the picture. The answer requires both law and culture, okay? So I think it's often the case when we come to the topic of social problems that our first instinct is, well, what's the law going to do about it? How's the law going to fix this? And the law is an important part of any story that we tell about social progress, but it can never and should never be the whole story. And one of the important reasons it should never be the whole story is because at the end of the day, we, I think, ought to value privacy, and we ought to value the realm of our development in our personal associations not touched by the law or with some limit to the reach of the law. And this is a very tricky issue, right? Because it even goes to the issue of how you think about the family. How do you think about issues of domestic violence? Okay, we want the law to be reaching all the way into the family, to be protecting people from things like domestic violence. So there is a way in which we do want the law to reach all the way down through all of our social relations. But at the same time that we want that, we also have to figure out how to push back and figure out where are the right places to limit the law. How do we protect privacy? How do we protect our development as individuals from our communities so that we can say to the world of law, here's the world that we want to live in, so that we do not live in a world where every single feature of our existence has been regulated. Right? We don't want that world, okay? And that's one of the hardest questions here. It's how you titrate the balance between regulation and what comes from the social sphere. And I think in order to titrate that correctly, we have to, as citizens, take responsibility for our cultural life and think about what it means to do right in our cultural world, in our cultural spheres. So I'll come back to culture in a second, but the point is law and culture need to work together if we are trying to build a new world. So on law, these are some of the domains that I think would require particularly close scrutiny if we actually wanted to build a connected world, okay? And I'm not going to go through all of them right now. My suggestion is our policy agenda with regard to issues of equality would look really different if we were walked through all of these policy domains and asked the question of how would we increase bridging ties by virtue of our policies in these domains, if that were one of the things we were trying to do. And just to give you an example, because it's a polemical example, in the sphere of education, for instance, I published an article last year where I argued that at elite colleges and universities, admissions should proceed by way of geographic lottery over a certain threshold of achievement. Right? Forget big admissions offices reading every single file. Just establish a basic threshold over which students will thrive at the institution, and maximize geographic diversity. Okay, that would be a very different approach to admissions. It would do a lot more to generate bridging ties on college campuses. One would have arguments about whether it was fair or not. I think that what the case can be made that it would be fair. The way the lottery would have to work is for every geographic zone from which a student was coming, they would be sort of the top one in terms of achievement from their zone. But if you do it at the level of zip code, you get quite significant geographic diversity, at any rate. And it's doable. It's doable if anybody wanted to do it. So that's just an example, okay? And you can go through. So I give you that example to indicate the nature of the sort of change in policy thinking that comes from asking the question, how do you maximize bridging relationships? So let's go to culture for a second. I've already indicated the kind of cultural work that I think is necessary. A feature of it is trying to figure out something that I'm not the first to call rooted cosmopolitanism. I get that phrase from a philosopher named Anthony Appiah, and that is this idea that it is possible to come from a cultural tradition, to know it, to appreciate it, to value it and celebrate it, and nonetheless also to be open to sharing of it, to the exchanges of traditions with people from other traditions, and to building new things in the space of those exchanges. But again, that requires a sort of different kind of education at the most basic level of even how we sort of learn to be in families. I've written a book, as you've heard, called Talking to Strangers, which spends a lot of time arguing about the ways in which we can all learn to speak with persuasively and for the goals of building trustworthiness and trust those who are very different from ourselves. And so that's a beginning of the effort to explain what's involved in bridging skills. Again, I think there's a lot more research work that could be done to help us all be better at bridging, and cultivating those skills at bridging are again, a matter of culture, not of law, right? Not of policy. And so that is a bigger, harder question. And then the last thing is I haven't got a good formulation for this one as of yet, and I would be grateful for any suggestions people have. My view, the view I've come to, is that you can never move anybody to a new situation unless you've actually already given them a concrete example or concrete picture of what it would be like to be in that new situation. In other words, you need something that's aesthetically appealing to people, that makes people want to go to that new place. You can't just be pushing people constantly from the old place. There needs to be a pull. And so the question is, so where can we find examples of something that might look more like a connected society, that we could start to understand better, hold up in front of our sights as something to aim for? Again, I've just started to ask myself this question, so I don't feel that I have a solid answer on this point. But for the time being, provisionally, I'd like to suggest that Toronto might possibly suggest some elements of such a story. It's a very multicultural city. It does have a very different relationship to its diversity than most American cities have. So I would certainly encourage, in your modern segregation project, I would encourage you to take some non-US cases as sort of thought resources, right? And so Toronto would be for me the sort of question, can we learn things from Toronto? Is my hunch right that it might in fact be closer to the connected society that I have in mind? And if so, why is it there? What have they done? What are their different policy choices? And what can we say about the pleasures of life in a place like Toronto? Are there gains at the level of basic pleasure from living someplace more like Toronto than in the cities that we know in this country? So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to your questions and comments.